Hello class, this is Chapter 1, Criminal Investigation, an Overview. The objectives we're going to cover in this chapter are: we will define criminal investigation, summarize the primary goals of the criminal investigation, list and describe the basic functions performed by investigators, understand the intellectual, psychological, and physical chain characteristics possessed by an effective investigator, describe the key aspects of the initial investigation, explain how investigators decide whether or not to pursue a criminal investigation, and what information they consider in this process. We will identify the various individuals and entities with whom successful investigators interrelate, and finally describe some of the ways investigators can protect against civil lawsuits. An observant police officer can initiate an important criminal investigation. Criminal investigation combines art and science and requires extraordinary preparation and training. We live in a high-tech society, so we have a lot of high-tech tools to help now. So therefore, citizens expect results more quickly. Investigators need to step up their technology and teamwork skills, and do on a regular basis. Let's talk about a brief history of criminal investigation. Some societies of historical significance include the Bow Street Runners, who were originally 6 police officers that were founded in 1749 in London. You have the Vidocq Society, which has been called by the U.S. Department of Justice's National Institute as a source in its latest publication titled National Best Practices for Implementing and Sustaining a Cold Case Investigation Unit. So that's what they specialize in. Then, of course, you have Scotland Yard, which is part of the London Metropolitan Police and Great Britain as a whole. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency, most Americans are familiar with, and all of them have made and contributed major advances in criminal investigation. There are some definitions pertinent to criminal investigation. A couple of key definitions. One is investigate, derived from the Latin investigare, meaning to track or trace. Criminal investigation consists of discovering, collecting, preparing, identifying, and presenting evidence. And then deductive reasoning, which involves the logical process and drawing a conclusion from specific facts and evidence. Some other specific terms you need to be familiar with. First is a criminalist. That's someone who studies specific type or types of crimes and becomes specialized in those. Forensic science, which involves post-mortem work and work at the scene of a crime. The crime, which is obviously self-explanatory. A felony, which is a major crime, and a misdemeanor, which is a minor crime. You have criminal statute, which means that most criminal law is established by statute, which is to say that most laws, well, all laws, are enacted by a legislature. An ordinance is a piece of legislation enacted by a municipal authority, like a city banning smoking in restaurants, for instance. And then you have the elements of the crime. Those are all the things that make up the crime as a whole. The primary goals of criminal investigations involve determining whether a crime has been committed, legally obtaining information and evidence to identify the responsible person, the arrest of the suspect, recovery of stolen property if there is some, and the ability to present the best possible case to the prosecutor. When it comes to basic investigative functions or the responsibility of all police personnel, they should first provide emergency assistance, next secure the crime scene, then photograph, videotape, and sketch the crime scene, take notes and write reports, draft legal documents such as search warrants and subpoenas, and search for, obtain, and process physical evidence. Next, they should obtain information from witnesses and suspects, conduct photographic and in-person lineups, identify suspects, conduct raids, surveillances, stakeouts, and undercover assignments, and ultimately testify in court. Now, there are characteristics of an effective investigator. First are intellectual characteristics: the ability to obtain and retain information, the ability to apply technical knowledge, the ability to remain open-minded, objective, and logical. They must be well organized and able to prioritize and manage cases effectively, and must be culturally adroit. When it comes to physiological characteristics, they must be emotionally well balanced, detached, inquisitive, suspecting, discerning, self-disciplined, and persevering. As far as being physically fit, they must be physically fit and of good vision and hearing. The investigative process itself is usually initiated by a personal observation or information from a citizen. It starts with a direction to proceed to a scene or a potential scene. The department policy defines who responds, and department policy also defines the duties of the individuals who respond. The initial response is usually handled by a patrol officer who's dispatched. At the point of arrival, they need to be aware that there may be a suspect still at large or near the scene. And as far as setting priorities, they also need to make sure they handle emergencies first, secure the scene, and investigate. As far as handling emergency situations at the scene, they need to be aware that a dying person may be present and have a confession or information to give. They also need to be notifying the proper authorities if there is a dead body at the scene or if there are other environmental hazards. Also, they must do their best to preserve the scene, as weather may change or destroy evidence, or the crime scene may be altered. At the point of arrival, the responding officer may find that the scene is either utter confusion or it may be completely deserted. So as far as setting priorities, they must handle emergencies first, again secure the scene, and do as much investigation or preliminary investigation as is possible. When handling emergency situations, sometimes emergencies dictate procedure. Emergency situations can cause adrenaline to flow, so people can be hyped up and over-agitated at a scene. If there's a suspect at or near the scene, policy determines interrogations, and if a suspect is arrested or people are taken into custody, then they must be issued a Miranda warning. If a suspect has recently fled, immediate action is required, so the responding officer or officers will call for backup. If a person is seriously injured, of course, emergency first aid needs to be called immediately, and medical assistance, and any suspects need to be accompanied to the hospital if they're injured. If there's a dead body at the scene, it must be left as it is found, and everything done to preserve the scene as possible. There are environmental hazards, so be aware of the scene surroundings and potential hazards like snakes, branches, wildlife, ice, snow, etc. As far as protecting the crime scene, it is the major responsibility of the first officers to arrive to do so. This is part of Locard's principle of exchange. The scene is critical because everything in the scene is potential evidence. So scene security must be maintained, and it also must be protected from destruction or alteration from the elements. So you might have to put up tarps or tents, ropes, and things like that to keep people out and keep the elements out. When conducting a preliminary investigation, it's important that victims, witnesses, and suspects are all questioned. Also, there should be a conduction of a neighborhood canvass. Measuring, photographing, videotaping, and sketching the scene is important, as well as searching for evidence. Also, identifying, collecting, examining, and processing physical evidence. Now, sometimes that's handled by very specific specialists. Also, make sure to record all statements and observations in notes. Screening involves the systematic evaluation of solvability factors, such as the existence of witnesses and physical evidence to determine which cases have the greatest likelihood of being solved and thus should be assigned for further investigation. You must maintain accurate, thorough, and up-to-date documentation of every step. When it comes to factors for follow-up investigation, not many cases, most cases require a follow-up investigation. Sometimes factors exist that are beyond the officer's control, like the suspect got away, for example. Weather can destroy evidence, witnesses can be uncooperative, and follow-up phase builds on what was learned initially. So that follow-up is extremely important because it helps build the case ultimately for the prosecution. Some of the newer tools that are available are crime analysis, mapping, and geographical information systems. These provide crime mapping and hotspot area geographic tools. Then there's data mining, which allows sifting through information, and this helps narrow the field of potential suspects. And also is newly developed case management software, which allows police to use offenders and reoffenders that can compile those cases into a single file and narrow the field of suspects that way. Now, a brief word about problem-oriented policing. Problem-oriented policing is a departmental-wide strategy aimed at solving persistent community problems. Data collected during criminal investigation can be extremely valuable to problem-oriented policing. And problem-oriented strategies can be used in criminal investigations in many ways. There are a lot of liaisons within a community policing paradigm or community. You have interrelations with community policing, uniform patrol versus detectives, for instance, dispatchers, prosecutors' staff, defense counsel, community corrections personnel, social services, physicians, coroners, and medical examiners, forensic crime laboratories, citizens, witnesses, and of course victims themselves. Major case task forces are combined task forces. These have become necessary for many crimes involving drugs, gangs, and terrorism, where you have large cartels or large gangs. It involves a multidisciplinary approach, a multi-jurisdictional investigation, metro crime teams, where you have different municipalities pulling together, and special investigation units dedicated to one particular incident, for instance. There are a lot of resources that law enforcement can depend on, every municipality. In federal law enforcement, there are numerous resources, most famously the FBI, but also ATF, for instance. And there also can be aid provided by local and state agencies. Then there's Interpol, which is the International Criminal Police Organization. They have a computerized database that is available to law enforcement agencies worldwide. As far as clearing a case and the remainder of the investigative process, there's access to the FBI's Uniform Crime Reporting, or UCR program, and their primary objective is to generate reliable information for use in law enforcement administration. There may be additional roles after closing the case where someone has to come in and provide testimony after a case has been solved, or they might have to produce documentation after a case has been quote-unquote closed, and might have to provide testimony in the future, for instance, in an appellate court. Now, a quick word about investigative productivity. Productivity is more than just issuing citation. It is also the utilization of investigative resources and the ultimate and entire performance of the department and the community itself. Avoiding civil liability is extremely important for all police officers. Civil liability refers to a person's degree of risk of being sued. It can happen through the officer performing effective policies and procedures and clearly communicating to all, thorough and continuous training, proper supervision and discipline, accurate and thorough police reports and exculpatory evidence. However, Section 1983 exists, which provides an individual the right to sue a state government employees and others acting, quote, under color of state law, end quote, for civil rights violation. However, Section 1983 does not provide civil rights. It is a means to enforce civil rights that already exist. Now let's summarize what we covered in this chapter. A good officer should determine whether a crime has been committed, legally obtain sufficient information and evidence, locate and arrest the suspect, recover stolen property if there is any. They should then present the best possible case to the prosecutor, provide cooperation and coordination of efforts which are required outside the police department, and finally, criminal investigation is indeed a mutual effort and a mutual aid agency effort as well. Class, thank you for your time. We'll see you next chapter. If you have any questions, please be sure to contact your instructor. And remember, this is a supplement to your textbook. Make sure that you're reading your textbook as well as utilizing this tool. Thanks again, and we'll see you next class.